My name is Rebekah, just in case you don't know me, and even if you do. I just thought I would start by sharing a little bit about myself. At the moment, I'm a university student. I'm studying psychology. I'm doing my honours year, and my research is looking at deaf people and specifically stuff around sign language. So I'm quite a fluent signer, so you might see a little bit of sign today, just it kind of slips in there. And I run the youth group here. So if you got shaving cream on your face earlier, it was the young people's idea, not mine. But something else you guys should know about me is that I'm really forgetful. I forget a lot of things. I forget my phone. I actually forgot it at youth group a couple of weeks back. And then I drove around the city looking for it. Anyway, it was a bit of a thing. I forget where I parked my car. I have walked to the wrong location before. A little bit embarrassing, but that's okay. And I forget people's names. You know when someone tells you their name and they've introduced you and you're like, yeah, and you can feel it leaving and it's gone. Anyway, bit of a battle. But I'm quite forgetful. I'm good at remembering some things, but I'm forgetful about a lot of things. But here's the great news. I'm not forgetful. It's not just me. We're all forgetful. Yay! And I can hear the doubters in the room. Some people are really convinced that they're not forgetful. But I've got news. The truth is, we're actually all forgetful. Our brains are made to forget things that come in. We can't remember every moment of everything and everything we've ever said. It just doesn't work. Our brains are made to forget things. We all forget things. So, on that note, if you've forgotten the previous sermons in this series, I've got a quick little recap. Or maybe it's your first time with us today. And so we've been going through the book of Deuteronomy, and that sits in the Old Testament of the Bible quite early on. And we've been talking a lot about rules, laws, and obedience. Because we've been hearing throughout the sermons that rules were given to the people of Israel. And they were given to them after they were freed as slaves. They were slaves in Egypt and they were freed. And as we heard in Emily's sermon, at the heart of those rules is all about loving God. And as we hear in the New Testament from Jesus, the heart of those rules is about loving God and loving others. And it's important to note that rules are framed for a particular period of time, but the heart of the rule never changes. And we're called to obey God's laws. And as we heard in Andy's sermon, we're called to obey them in trusting that God will provide the life he promises when we obey. And we see many aspects of those themes of obedience and finding life in obedience in the reading today. But today we're not just talking about obedience, we're talking about remembering. And here are some fun facts about remembering. I feel the need as like a psychology student just to share the fun facts I have. And my first fun fact is that we're really bad at remembering. You may have forgotten that from when I said it about a minute ago, but we're really, really bad at remembering. We forget things all the time, and it's just how we roll. And we don't just forget information, we misremember information. Because something really interesting about the way we remember things is we often misremember things. We'll see a certain situation or an event, and the way we hold it in our minds often captures some biases or our perception of that event. And when we then later retell those events, we'll often retell it with our misconstruals in it. And if that's a bit too much psychobabble for you, to put it more simply, we remember the stories we tell. And I use the word stories here to try and capture the idea that our memories aren't perfect. They don't perfectly capture a situation. So we remember the stories that we tell. And the way we tell a story the first time, we'll probably tell the story a similar way in the following times we remember it. Now, I thought I'd just start with a bit of an example of a memory. Some of you guys might remember a couple years ago now, we held a youth group dinner. It was really, really cool. We, as a youth group, we got together, we cooked a whole bunch of food. There's a bit of preparation involved, but once the night started, I got to kind of float around the room, chat to people, eat some dinner, get involved in the activities at the front. It was heaps of fun. And I loved it. Oh man, it was such a good time. And I remember that event with that lens. It was an awesome time. It was heaps of fun. But the truth is, there was a group of people who spent the entire night in the kitchen. And they spent the entire night in the kitchen doing things like cooking frantically and doing dishes a little bit frantically because there weren't enough utensils for everyone. Anyway, it was a bit of a thing. And then the hot water ran out, and so they're trying to wash all the dishes with cold water. And I'm not saying it was a negative event for them, because I think they had fun, but the way they remember that event is a little bit different from the way I remember that event. And because I have told stories about the dinner in time gone past, and I remember the story I tell of an awesome night where I had a great time. Shout out to the team in the kitchen. Because we remember the stories we tell. Now let's jump into today's reading. I'm going to be focusing in a lot on verse 9. And verse 9 goes, "Only be careful and watch yourselves closely, so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen, or let them fade from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to their children after them." So we're clearly getting told to remember. We need to remember. That's really explicit in these instructions. But what are we meant to be remembering? Well, in this story, Moses is speaking to the Israelites. And he's reminding them of the things God has done for them. That's what they're meant to be remembering, what God has already done for the people of Israel. Because God saved the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. And when they were then wandering the desert and they were hungry, God gave them bread from the sky. God gave them light, gave them direction, and God's promise to give them land. And what we see here is that the Israelites have a constant need for God. They are incapable of living without Him. And God continually provides for them. And what I think is really cool about God's provision for them is that it's not just this intangible, hypothetical things God's going to give them. God has physically provided for them. They have seen the glory of God with their own eyes. In verse 11, it says, "You came near and stood at the foot of the mountain while it blazed with fire to the very heavens. With black clouds and deep darkness, the Lord your God spoke to you out of the fire." Because in all these things where we get to hear what God has done, we learn not just about what God has done, but who God is. Because God has provided for the people of Israel, He is saying He will continue to provide for the people of Israel, and He always does what He says we will. And we're being called to remember who God is. But what's interesting is we're not just called to remember, we're called to teach. Both verse and 9 talk about teaching children our memory of God, what we know about God. In verse 9, it says something along the lines of, "Teach the things you have seen to your children and to their children after them." Because what God has done is so good and so amazing, when the Israelites see it, they don't just see it with their eyes, it changes them profoundly. It changes them to their core. It changes them to their hearts. They're so profoundly moved by who God is and who they know God to be. It's engraved on their heart. We see that in verse 9 when it talks about, "Don't let the things your eyes have seen fade from your heart." So when we see the glory of God, it becomes something that we don't just know. That memory of God is not something that just sits within us. It flows out of us, and it becomes the story we share and a story we teach. So, we should remember, but you may remember from earlier, we're quite forgetful. And a bit of a spoiler alert to the rest of the story. The Israelites were told to remember, and you know what they do? They forget. Whoa, shocker, mind-blowing. Because all people, you, me, the Israelites, we're all terrible at remembering things. And the story of Israel forgetting, or God's people forgetting, turning away from God, realizing that was a bit of a mistake and then trying to go back to God, is a recurring and just a pattern in the Bible. It's a cyclic story. It just happens over and over and over again. And we know they forget, but what is the consequence for them of forgetting? Well, for the Israelites, they were pretty explicitly told not to forget. It's quite a clear instruction. And we get an example of when you don't follow what God says. We get an example of what happens in verses 3 and 4. They say, "You saw with your own eyes what the Lord did at Baal-Peor. The Lord your God destroyed from among you everyone who followed the Baal of Peor. But all of you who held fast to the Lord your God are still alive today. And at Baal of Peor, they turned away from God. And so what we see there is that when we disobey and we turn away from God, there is death and destruction. But when we stay focused and turn towards God and obey, there is life. Now, death seems like quite a big consequence for not following God, for turning away, especially with the knowledge that we will inevitably forget. Humans are very forgetful. We will forget. It's quite assured. So I want to pose that when we turn away from God, when we misremember who God is, I think there is a sort of death there. And it's in the sense that there is a missed opportunity to experience the life offered by remembering. We can't stand on the promises of God if we've forgotten what those promises are. It's a lot harder to trust in God's promises when you forget how he's fulfilled the promises in the past. And we can't teach promises in any way if we can't remember what those promises are. And what might be even scarier than just forgetting who God is or what God's promises are is that we're actually way more likely to misremember who God is. It is so easy to misremember or only remember a part or a version of events. I can remember that night of the youth dinner. It was a huge success. It was pretty straightforward. I got a lot of thanks. People kept telling me I was doing a great job. It felt pretty good. And to be honest, I reckon I could probably go hold a youth dinner tonight, pull it together. Don't need anyone else, I've got this. But that would really undermine the work of the people in the kitchen. And it really doesn't capture the whole story. But I could start believing it does. And I think as the church, sometimes we start to tell a story of self-sufficiency. That with or without God, we are enough. Or maybe we don't even need God. God needs us. Or perhaps that when we were saved by God, it was because we deserved it. Because we were righteous enough to be saved, we earned our salvation. See, I think one of the biggest potholes we can fall into as Christ's people and as people who have been saved is believing we did something to be saved. We followed enough rules, we followed them well enough, we followed them to the letter of the law, we did it right, and we were saved. But that's a very forgetful story to tell. That forgets that at every step of the journey, we failed. And at every step, humanity has fallen short. Because at every step, us individually or us collectively have failed to follow the rules. And that starts with Adam and Eve in the garden, and that continues on to us today. But what's amazing is at every step, God met us and saved us anyway. When Adam and Eve disobeyed the one rule God had given them in the garden, he clothed them and gave them a life outside of the garden. So they suffered consequences to their actions, but they were met by a gracious, merciful God. We see that when the Israelites disobey what God has told them in the desert, they suffer consequences for that, but they are ultimately met with a gracious and merciful God who will lead them to the promised land anyway. Because there is so much grace and mercy from God in the face of human failure. And quite possibly the scariest thing is that we do not only misremember the story of God, but we can teach that misremembering, that story, to others. Because I think we can begin to teach people that somehow they need to be or do enough to be saved by God. But that's not the story. A frequent conversation I seem to find myself having is the right of people to be here with us in this building, to walk in through those doors and be welcomed in this place. And I'm meaning this physical building. Young people and friends in this conversation I keep landing myself in is that they say to me, hey, I can't be here. I don't follow the rules. I've failed at following the rules. And what might even be worse is I'm not even sure I believe all of the rules. And This is a conversation I keep having, and I keep having to say to them, no, but you're welcome here anyway. That's not the point. And I don't know where they learnt that from or who taught them that, but following rules well enough has never been the reason we're allowed to be here. That has never been the point. Because if following the rules well enough is the reason we can be here, no one should be here. But we're invited to be here anyway. And it's because Jesus invites us to be here. But as the hands and feet of Jesus, as Christ's people, it's our job to be the ones here on earth saying it, teaching it to others. Because it's not just enough to remember who God is and that God welcomes us into this place. We need to teach it. I met this woman about a year or so back, and she's so cool. She talks heaps about God. That was one of the first things I noticed about her. We just be constantly having these conversations about God. And every day she'd rock up to work with a new story about something God had done in her life. It was nuts. I was like, another one? Like, where are these coming from? And it was crazy because God was in every part of her life. God was in her broken down car trying to make it home. God was with her when she journeyed with people who were going through some really hard things. And God was with her when she saw this jacket she wanted to buy, but it was too expensive. And so she chatted away and she told God that she'd really wanted this jacket, but it was too expensive. But if it cost this amount, she'd be able to buy it, but that's just how it goes. And the next day she was walking past that shop again, and lo and behold, the jacket was now the price she could afford. And so she went and she bought that jacket. And what was astounding to me about that story is the memory of God she holds is not one of a God that's in certain areas of her life, but of a God that's in every part of her life. And that taught me a lot about God. I think a challenging aspect is what we teach about God is inherently linked to the memory we hold of who God is. And generally speaking, we don't mean to misremember. We just do. It's a part of being human. We will remember things incorrectly. But that means we need to be thoughtful, critical, considerate, and take time to reflect on the memory of God we hold. Because the truth of God is a God of glory, a living God, a God who's so big and so great and so amazing. We're never going to quite be able to hold that memory right, but we need to do our best to hold that memory as close to it as we can. We also have to own the fact that we're going to fail to remember. We will inadvertently, or maybe accidentally, or through whatever process, share stories of God that aren't true. We might teach a story of God that is wrong, but it is our job as God's people to really try and do it right, to really try and hold that memory, to really take the time and the effort to think about what's the story of God we're teaching. What is our memory of God? Because there is such a beauty and such a truth to the glory of a God who saw us in every inch of our failure, and just like we heard in Genesis, said it was good. So I'll leave you with two questions. What story are you telling about God? And who do you remember God to be?